Sorry. All right, so today we're talking about global soils, and we want to understand how soils are formed. We want to understand different types of soils. We want to understand what soil really is. We want to understand how climate affects soil and how soil affects climate. Now, I love talking about soil. Soil is one of my favorite topics in physical geography. And it's funny because when I was a grad student, I had to take a seminar in soil, and I did not want to do that at all. I remember overhearing these two other grad students who were taking the same seminar the following semester, and they were like so excited about it. And I was like, who are you kidding? Nobody is excited about taking a freaking seminar on soil. But then I took it and I was like, this is amazing. Like, soil is freaking fantastic. It's a balance, it's a balance of so many different elements. It's what physical geography is all about. So what I mean by that, I will get into later. So keep in mind balance, and it's really where physical geography is all coming together. We are at a point in the semester now where hopefully you start to see that quote that I have. There is a train going by my house right now, sorry. I live right next to the train tracks. I like it. Um, so hopefully you're starting to see that quote that I put in the beginning of the semester on your syllabus, the John Muir quote that when you pull one part of the universe, you find it connected to everything else. Hopefully by this point in geography, you are seeing the system that we can learn about climate, we can learn about the lithosphere, we can learn about the hydrosphere, we can learn about the biosphere, we can learn all the different elements that go into them, but every single one is affected by, impacted, and impacts every single other one. So every one of those spheres is constantly affecting, impacting, and is they're largely dependent on each other, and they're also affected by each other. And soil is one of the ways where hopefully you're going to start to see this all come together, because soil is, a little bit of the lithosphere being eroded, which we talked about earlier in the semester. It's a little bit of biomass and the breaking down of biomass. It is a little chemistry. It's got the climate in there, and our entire biosphere depends on soil and the health of soil. And depending on where you are, you have adapted to that soil. So soil is so much more than just dirt. And I posted 2 different TED Talks that go with this lecture. So one is on the chemistry of soil, and if you think like, I don't want to hear that, it's really, really interesting. It's about how we basically reduce our soil to just a whole bunch of different chemicals instead of seeing that it's something that is alive, that all that chemistry happens because there's bacteria and plankton and everything that are basically constantly having sex in the soil, and that like soil orgy is what leads to all this other life on the planet. So watch that one. And then there's another one again on soil and how soil affects climate change, how it mitigates climate change, and how we need to be concerned with soil because we have a lot of people on the earth and we need to continue to feed them. And if we continue to destroy our soil the way that we've been doing, and also reducing our food, and this is the way the 2 TED Talks complement each other too, is that they both talk about how we're reducing our food, we're taking away a lot of the nutrition of our food, and we're basically growing quantity over quality. And if we really want to keep our soil healthy, keep our climate intact so that we can continue to live in the current climate that we have adapted to, that if we want to continue to feed our increasing population, our population by some estimates is going to hit 11 billion by 2050. By other estimates, it's going to hit 9 billion. But we need to keep our soil healthy in order to feed all those people. And by the way, we grow enough food today to feed 11 billion people. The problem is it's not sustainable the way that we grow it. And I'll go into that, and both those TED Talks go into that as well. Okay, so soil. Here's 2 quotes for you. If you're not criticized, you may not be doing much. Think about that, what that means. I know that you're all, that we all are criticized on different levels and in so many different ways. And so maybe it's a reminder that, if you're being criticized, or if you're not being criticized, maybe you should be criticized a little bit. Think about what that means. Tell me what that means to you all. And then I've got a Zen proverb here, because studying soil is something that is very Zen. So chopping wood before enlightenment, chopping wood after enlightenment. What do you think that means? So what does it mean to say chopping wood before enlightenment, chopping wood after enlightenment? All right. Think the matrix. Okay. So first, when we're talking about soil, we need to understand how the climate affects soil. The soil affects climate, but the climate affects soil, because it's physical geography. Everything connects to everything else. So first, it takes about at least 500 years. It takes at least 500 years to form topsoil, and specifically a type of topsoil. And that has everything to do with the climate. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But you have about, like I said, at least 500 years, but really it takes more like thousands of years. And that's one of the reasons that the way that we're using our topsoil today is so unsustainable, because this is something that takes a very long time to regenerate. It doesn't regenerate super quickly. And the way that we're growing things, and we've talked in class about how important, when we talked about, for example, water, and how if we don't have roots in place, if we don't have plants or trees, and you have all of this exposed topsoil, and we get like a whole huge downpour, what happens to that topsoil? It picks up and floats right away, right? And so like all through the Mississippi drainage basin, the way that we're farming today, we leave entire states full of topsoil just open, not growing anything, no plants holding that soil in place, no trees sucking up that 52,000 gallons of water for your average tree. What we have is just topsoil that's exposed, and it's lifted up and dumped basically into the Mississippi drainage basin and gets pushed out into the Gulf of Mexico. Last year alone in the US, we lost 1.7 billion tons of topsoil. 1.7 billion tons of topsoil. And I know you're thinking like, well, there's just dirt underneath it. But as we're going to see, soil is layered, like anything that's complex, it has layers. And that topsoil, that very, very top part of our soil, because of the plants that we grow, that very top part of our soil is extremely important to all 7.7 billion people who live on the planet right now. So, and I'll get into that more. I have here that soil is the Earth's filtration system. What does that mean to you for me to say soil is the Earth's filtration system? Think about what your filtration system does at your house. If you have one, you have like a Brita or something like that, that takes water. The water goes through it, right? It filters through it. It takes out a lot of harmful chemicals or different things that might make the water taste bad. Well, that same thing is happening with soil. Basically, the health of the soil and the balance of the soil is going to affect how much of the soil, if it's healthy, acts like a sponge, right? So if you get a little bit of rain, that rain goes into the soil and the soil just soaks it up. If you get excess rain, that water is going to make its way through the soil down into our aquifers. We've talked about aquifers and the whole soil water belt that happens underneath us. And so if as that water makes its way down, soil does the same thing that our Brita filtration system does, where it sucks out certain elements, certain chemicals from the water. Remember, water also absorbs chemicals, like when we talked about carbonic acid and what happens when water goes through soil, sucks in some carbon, and then makes its way onto limestone and erodes that limestone with that carbonic acid. So you have it going both ways. But our soil, and healthy soil specifically, not just dirt, but healthy soil, is what allows for that water to be filtered. And we want it to be filtered because it makes its way down into the aquifer and then it cycles back up to us. Soil is our breadbasket. I mean, that's kind of a like misnomer, but that that's where all of our food comes from. Even if you're thinking like, well, I just like eating animals. Well, your animals have to eat something as well. They're not necessarily eating other animals. They're eating plants. So no matter how you look at it, you have to ingest part of the soil. And so the health of our soil, again, directly relates to the health of us, the health of our atmosphere, the health of everything. And we throw away about 30% of our food. So not only are we destroying our topsoil to grow this food, but then we're not even eating all of it. So our topography, soil horizons, and I'll get into what soil horizons are, but basically they're the layers, are thicker on flat ground than with a steep slope. That makes sense. That's just a little something about, how if you're on a hill, you're going to have a lot thinner of topsoil, as opposed to if you're down in a valley, you're going to have thicker topsoil. And that should tell you something about how people can farm in different places. If we live in a mountainous region, if we live in the Andes, for example, then how is your soil going to be limited? Because you have this thinner topsoil. And if you have that thinner topsoil and you live in the Andes and we're seeing the destruction of our topsoil, how much faster are people who live in very mountainous regions going to be affected by that inability to grow food because of the degradation of their topsoil? Does that make sense? So if you are a country like Bolivia, which is basically all up in the Andes, your topsoil is even more important because it's thinner because of that slope. And then I have this question over here. Well, I just answered why. And then how are north-facing slopes further affected? What do you all think? You all are geographers, at least in this class right now. How would a north-facing slope be further affected? So think about it. So what happens is, let's say that we have the world, and we know that the sun focuses in at 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator. Well, imagine you have a mountain up here, the northern part of the world, and with a north-facing slope, is it going to get nearly as much sun as if you have a south-facing slope? Now that's really only in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, then you're going to have the same issue with southern facing slopes. Okay, soil moisture. And I'm sorry that this bar gets in the way of a lot of the headlines but it says soil moisture. So soil moisture, like I was saying, soil is the Earth's filtration system. Depending on the health of your soil stores a whole lot of water. You have excess water pulled down by gravity, and that feeds our aquifers. We have what's called evapotranspiration. And I know that I've mentioned evapotranspiration in class before, but just to remind you, evaporation, the word evaporation, I know that you know what that means, but it's the transfer of water from its liquid state or its frozen state to its gas state. And when we see like just the transfer of water from its liquid state to its gas state, we're referring to evaporation. Transpiration is what happens when you have water that's trapped in soil that goes from its liquid to its gas state, or what is being expelled by different plants. So I've talked about this in class before, but we have pores on our body, and our pores sweat out water vapor when we're hot, when we're schwitzing, if you will. Oh, it's Passover starting today, so schwitz is a good word of the day. Well, plants have this. Plants also expel water vapor, but they expel it out of their pores, which are called stomata. And if you remember, we've talked about that in class. I wrote it on the board, stomata. And so the collection of both the transpiration of water vapor from plants and soil and the evaporation of water from its liquid state to its vapor state, that is all of the accumulation of vapor in the atmosphere. And water vapor is one of our 3 greenhouse gases. Again, we haven't talked about climate yet, but when we do, we'll learn about the 3 greenhouse gases. And water vapor is also, you need water vapor in the air in order for water vapor to condense and precipitate and rain back down fresh water. So when we look at the health of our soil, a lot of the health of our soil has to do with the ability for our soil to store water, for that water to go down into aquifers or that water to be stored until it's evaporated out. Just think about how that happens. You have a whole bunch of rain, nice healthy soil is going to act like a sponge and keep that water inside the soil, and then you're going to have heat. And let's imagine plants, right? So here we have some plants right here, and those plants have their little roots down in the soil, and so it rains, but it's not going to necessarily rain every single day, and that plant is going to need water. So what happens when you have nice healthy soil, that sponge that allows for that water, some of it to be retained in the soil, is going to feed those plants later. It's going to feed those plants water later. So you have these plants who are, they've got their little roots in the soil, they've got their leaves coming out, and as those leaves get heated up, the plant needs more water. So what it does is it leads to this whole just cycle where the sun's energy comes down on the plant's leaf, it heats it up, and so from like down inside the body of the plant into its roots, what it does is that draws water vapor up, or draws water up into the plant. The plant cycles that water through its body, and then it releases the water vapor through its stomata. Does that make sense? So you've got this plant, and it's got, it's sitting in the soil. It rained a couple days ago, so that plant was fed with water and it's happy. And then a couple days later, it starts to dry out. There hasn't been rain, and maybe it's a warm day. And so the sun's energy is beating down on that plant, and that plant is drying out. So it reaches down in through the soil, and it draws on that water that has been sitting in that nice, healthy, spongy soil. And then that water gets drawn up through the sun is basically activating this movement of water from the soil up through the plant. It hydrates that plant, helps that plant stay alive, and then that plant releases the water vapor through its stomata. So if we don't have a healthy soil that allows for the sponginess, the sponge-like quality that keeps that water in the soil, then what you're going to have are plants that are going to die very quickly, plants that aren't going to be able to sustain themselves for multiple reasons, but also because, oh, there goes another train. This one is a cargo train, so it's going to be especially long. I should have shut my door before I started doing this, but my cat knocks on the door, and it's really distracting. I don't even know if you can hear me right now. All right, so still going. All right, so our soil water storage, still going. Our soil water storage has to do with the available amount of water. It has to do with the health of that soil. And when we look at our surface of soil particles, field capacity, that's the capacity to hold water. And then wilting point, that's all available water has been removed from the soil. So now the sun has heated up the plants, right? The leaves have led to this evapotranspiration, where basically the sun works literally as an energy that allows the plants to suck that water out of the soil, run it through their bodies, comes out as vapor through the stomata. And when they no longer have any water to draw on, when the soil is dry, that's when it hits its wilting point. Hygroscopic water, that's the surface of soil particles. So that's like where you have, that's the water that's being stored in the soil. Okay, so soil, what is soil? So I keep talking about soil and I keep saying it's not dirt. Well, what is it? Excuse me. So soil is our natural terrestrial, so terrestrial, it's earth, surface. I've heard a lot of scientists refer to soil as the earth's skin. If you imagine that the soil is the earth's skin, and if you know how important your skin is to the health of your body, to temperature regulation, to letting certain things in and out of your body, you can maybe get an idea of what soil is doing for the balance of the earth and the balance of the earth's climate and stuff like that. So it's our natural terrestrial surface layer. It contains minerals. Where does it get those minerals from? So it gets those minerals from eroded rock. Remember earlier in the semester, we talked about the lithosphere and how the lithosphere is constantly building itself up in the form of mountain building and plateau building and new rocks that are built through plutons, all the stuff that we talked about earlier in the semester. So now it's built itself up, and then wind and water come along, and what does it do? It breaks it down, transports it, erodes it. So we have our rocks, our mountains, our lithosphere that is constantly building up the surface of the earth, creating mountains, creating plateaus, creating islands, all that good stuff. And then along comes water and wind and just is constantly working to break down what the lithosphere just built up. And so as it breaks down the lithosphere, the rock, it breaks it down into smaller and smaller pieces, transports it, and we know all the ways that it's transported, from gravity to creep to debris flows to landslides, all the stuff that we've talked about with mass wasting. So you have erosion, you have mass wasting, the transport, and then that material, when it breaks down smaller and smaller, that's part of the chemistry of soil. So if you remember, rock is made up of a lot of different elements. So if you remember what a rock is, real quick, a rock is 2 or more minerals, right? And what is a mineral? It's the crystalline chemical compound of a chemical. So crystalline chemical compound is a mineral. 2 or more of those makes a rock. And so now when that rock is broken down by water and by wind, broken down into small pieces, can you see how that becomes the mineral content of soil? That the minerals that created that rock, now broken down, create that soil. And then you have the organic matter. So what is the organic matter? That's the living matter, or the matter that was once living. So think about over here, we have trees. You've got like, all kinds of animals living among this little forest in here. Just imagine you have like an ocelot or, a panther walking along. I know that that is not the landscape that a panther would live in, but I just saw my cat and she kind of looks like a panther. So that's why that came to my head. So you've got, no, this is going to sound terrible because I just related it to my cat, but you've got an animal walking through and I don't know, lightning bolt hits it and it's dead. And then it decomposes into the soil, like Mustafa talked about in The Lion King, how, what does he say? Simba's like, but we eat the antelope. And he's like, yes, but eventually we die and we decompose, I don't know if he says decompose, into the soil. And then the grass grows from the soil and the antelope eats the soil, all completing the circle of life. So when we're talking about organic matter, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all of the living things, the plants, the animals that die, decompose into the soil, and then their carbon becomes part of, and their organic matter becomes part of that soil. And so those are 2 very important parts of soil: the mineral content, the broken down rock, and the broken down biomass, the decomposed living things, whether it's plants, whether it's animals, all of them decompose, and they both are significant parts of the soil, significant elements of the soil, but they are only 50% of the soil. So sometimes people maybe think like, oh, eroded rock plus biomass creates soil. No, it creates half of soil. So biomass, mineral content, 50% of soil. The other 50% is open pore space. And I know you might think like negative space does not equal a component of soil, but it does. So why do you think that this would be such a important component of soil? Why would we need 50% open pore spaces? Think about it. Well, what does that allow in? Water, air, all of that comes in and continues to breathe life into that soil, the water, the air. And think about what allows for that 50% open pore space. Some of it has to do with the composition of the soil. If you have very like rocky soil, you can kind of see how there would be a lot of open pore space between rocky soil. But think about worms. You know, worms. So worms are sometimes called the Earth's gardeners. And the reason that they're called the Earth's gardeners is basically what they do is their bodies are just tubes, and they move through the soil, and they're like eating the soil, and coming out the back of them is what's called worm casting, which is really just a nice name for worm poo. So one thing that they're doing is they're creating this really rich soil by ingesting that soil and then moving it along through their body. But then they're also creating these little tubes, and those tubes account for a lot of this 50% open pore space that allows water and oxygen and all that good stuff to continue to come in and infiltrate the soil and keep the health of the soil viable. So our chemical processes that alter the mineral composition of the parent material, what does that mean? Think about it. When we talked about the erosion and weathering of rock, we talked about how there was two different types, right? The physical weathering, where water and wind comes and breaks down that rock, and the chemical weathering, where so if a rock is essentially two or more crystalline chemical compounds, minerals, and you introduce a new chemical, well, what's going to happen? A chemical reaction. Well, that same thing can happen when that rock is eroded down into smaller pieces, and we have new chemicals that are introduced to the mineral composition. So the already existing chemicals in the parent material, the rock's parent material, that can change the composition of the rock. Just like a new chemical compound being introduced to an existing rock can change the composition of that rock, well, a new chemical compound that's introduced to the mineral composition of soil can also change that soil. Make sense? If that doesn't make sense, you can email me. Our parent material, that's the inorganic material base. And when we talk about parent material, we're talking about the inorganic. So what is the inorganic material base? What is that? Think about it. The inorganic material base is the eroded rock, right? The organic material base is the biomass. The inorganic is the eroded rock. And then weathering, just to remind you, is the physical, chemical, biological processes that break down the parent material. The parent material being the rock. All right, so other components of soil, we have the regolith. Now remember, we've talked about regolith. What is regolith? Think about it. What is regolith? We've talked about it in class before. So we've got over here our layer of soil, and remember, soil is going to be eroded rock, biomass, 50% open pore space, and then underneath that is our regolith. So if you remember what regolith is, that's going to be just eroded rock. So why do we have just eroded rock down here, and up here we have eroded rock and biomass? Well, what's happening is the biomass is coming from these plants and animals that might be living in this ecosystem, and they're breaking down and decomposing into the soil, and they're going to feed these plants. They're going to keep that soil nice and spongy so that it retains water, all the stuff that we talked about. But we also have our eroded rock, our parent material, that is, being transported from, let's say, a mountain up here. You have some eroded rock that's transported. That's going to settle in, blend in with that biomass, but that regolith is heavier. So it's also going to, where did my arrow just go? It's also going to get pulled down into this lower layer because it's heavier. Plus, of course, this is eroded rock as well. Or sorry, this is rock, this is lithosphere. So this is parent material as well. So we're going to see this eroded, broken apart layer of just parent material underneath the soil. And then humus, I know that I've said that term before. I think I've said that term before, but humus is the organic. Humus is the organic material. It's the it's the good stuff that basically feeds the plants. So if you have like really rich, humus-rich soil is like nice, you know, thick soil. You're going to break it apart. It's going to like stick together a little bit. It's going to be spongy. That's what feeds your plants. So a humus-rich soil, that's a soil that's rich in the vitamins and the minerals that are needed by a plant. Okay, so let me move my face. All right, so our soil has different horizons. Remember I mentioned that term before earlier, horizons, what's layers. So our soil has different layers. And our soil horizons are distinctive layers of soil because we have gravity, because we have evapotranspiration. All of the elements of soil are constantly being pulled down and being pulled up. So evapotranspiration, energy from the sun that leads to plants sucking up humus and water. That's going to move material up. And then gravity is going to pull material down. So because material is constantly like transferring through layers of soil, different horizons of soil are going to have concentrations of different elements of soil. You're going to see more biomass up here, right? You're going to see more regolith down here in a lower layer of soil. So let's look at what our different horizons are. And if we were in class, I would make you all come up with some sort of acronym to go with O, A, E, B, and C. So O, sometimes students like to do orangutans. One acronym I can think of that people have come up with in class is orangutans. Orangutans always eat, what was it? Always eat bananas and coffee or something like that. That doesn't make sense. Orangutans don't eat coffee. I don't think they eat bananas either, though. So orangutans always eat bread and what starts with a C that they would eat. Cholula is the only thing I can think of. Orangutans always eat bread and Cholula. Whatever. Come up with your own acronym so you can remember these different layers. All right. So the O horizon, that is going to be the top horizon, and we're going to have more biomass. Why would we have more biomass? Well, two reasons. Biomass is coming from above the soil, right? It's the breakdown of organic material. And two, that's the part that's with evapotranspiration is going to be constantly pulled up. That's what the plants want, that biomass, right? They're basically feeding off of that biomass. That makes it sound kind of vulgar, but so that organic material is going to rise to the top more, and it's going to come from the top. And then the dark colored layer of mixed mineral and organic material, that's your true balance of soil, that A horizon. So that A horizon, if it's healthy, it's going to be a nice dark colored soil. And it's going to be your mix of parent material, that's mineral content, and organic matter, that's biomass. Our E horizon is going to be light colored. It's going to be more mineral, so it's going to be more parent material. And then our B horizon is an accumulation of clay minerals. So that's going to be your very heavy minerals, the ones from the parent material that get they're really being pulled down by gravity. So that's where we're going to see more clay. Now that clay also acts as a sponge to water. So the nice healthy soil acts as a sponge to water, but so does this clay. Think about clay and its consistency. So this gives, if you imagine that we have lots of plants and stuff growing up here, you have the health of the soil that hopefully is retaining water like a sponge, but then this is also going to be like a second layer of sponge material. And then down here on our C horizon, that is weathered parent rock. That's just straight up weathered parent rock. That's our regolith. All right, so we have the horizons, and then we have the vertical. Wait, that's not vertical. This is vertical. Horizontal. Oh, that's horizon again. We have the, let's say, advectional movement. So we have the overland flow that's also happening. And now we've talked about this when we talked about fresh water. And remember when we talked about floodplains? So just imagine how inside the horizons, you've got the biomass, you've got the broken down parent material, but that's all kind of like isolated to right here to the layers of the soil horizon. But up on top of the soil, you also have the movement of material kind of going. So you have movement of material going this way vertically, which is confusing because then there's horizons on top of it, like in that vertical movement. But then you also have this horizontal movement of material going like overland. That makes sense. So you have material being transported like down and up, if you will, through the horizons of soil, and then you have material that's being transported overland. Okay, so that's where all the stuff we learned about mass wasting comes in. When you have a landslide, think about how a landslide is going to transport material, take that material. So if we had like a more dramatic hill here, that landslide would take material and sorry, that didn't really like warrant an but that's what my reaction was. Okay, so let's say we have a landslide that's going to take material, that's going to take biomass, that's going to take mineral content, and it's going to bring it into this soil. Then maybe it wouldn't necessarily change that soil type, but it might add to that soil. It would rejuvenate that soil. And then we talked about floodplains and how, look at this, this is a perfect floodplain. So we've got the channel of the river, right? So remember, a floodplain is two different parts. It's the channel of a river, and then it's the land that is next to a river. So we've got our nice channel of a river here. And remember, rivers are amazing. They're transporting material, they're transporting biomass, they're their own ecosystems, they're transporting sediment, and they're feeding the riparian communities that are all along this river channel. Remember, we've talked about that, where you've got a riparian community, that's a community of plants that's right next to a river. We have discussed that earlier in the semester. And this channel is bringing water, it's bringing mineral content, it's bringing biomass. And those plants in the riparian community are sucking up that biomass, they're sucking up that water, they're being fed by that channel. But every once in a while, then you're going to have an excess of water in this channel, which is going to lead to this overland flow. And when we have that overland flow into our floodplain that surrounds that channel, we have what's called lateral movement, lateral migration of the channel. That lateral migration is going to bring with it all the biomass, all the mineral content, all the stuff that's being kept in that channel. And that is going to move in, and it's going to basically rehydrate and give more biomass and more sediment, that mineral content and that organic content of soil. So we have our movement of material through the different horizons up and down, and then we also have overland flow that helps with the makeup of that soil. Okay, so we got the transport of sediment, we got the transport of material coming out of the channel. It's all just working together. It's an amazing process. All right, transformation. Transformation is the decomposition of materials. So transformation, when we're talking about soil, is the decomposition of materials. So our organic materials, when they're transforming from a puma to, or a lion, or a plant, to the broken down chemical compounds, basically, that created that living sentient being, that decomposition of materials adds the organic material to our soil. What decomposes those materials? What breaks down materials? Why does organic material like a banana peel in a compost bin, why does it eventually break down into the chemicals that enrich that soil? Well, that's where bacteria comes in. So here's bacteria all around us, constantly doing work for us for free by breaking down this organic material and enriching our soil with this broken down organic mass, because of the work of bacteria that we can't see, constantly working around us all the time. So what happens if we are relying on chemical agents to kill weeds, to kill pests, and to, when we look at how we fertilize our soil, what we do today, there's all kinds of fertilizers for our soil. I think that I've talked about those fertilizers before, that human waste, animal waste, waste is all fertilizer for soil. But instead today we've taken this farm. So a farm, like like a, a substance sorry, a subsistence farm that's is basically going to be its own kind of engineered ecosystem where you have plants and animals, and they're all sort of working together to create whatever that farm is producing. So let's say we have some corn over here, we have some tomatoes, we have some potatoes growing, plus we have pigs, plus we have goats, plus we have some cows. Well, they're all working together. Oh, chickens, we want to have some chickens. So just imagine you have soil that is healthy enough to support the growth of all these different plants. But you can't just have that soil constantly growing plants without refertilizing it. So what we used to do, what a mid-scale organic farm would do today, is they would have a plot of land where you're growing all your plants. And then over here, you have your cattle or your goats or whatever, and they're grazing on this land. And so those, let's say goats are walking along, they're grazing the land, they're producing milk, you're making goat cheese. And then you have chickens all around those goats. And what those chickens do is they get into the goat waste. They get into the goat, I'm trying to think of a better word for poo, but they get into the goat poo and they eat bacteria out of it. So if you look at any migrating animal, if you look at any large herbivore, whether it's buffalo, bison, okapi, gnus, like any large migrating, so you have animals that are herbivores, they're usually in big packs. That's one of the ways that they protect themselves from predators. Here comes like a lion. If you're in a mass group, that lion's only going to take out maybe one of you, and so that way you have this the safety of the larger community. But those migrating animals are generally followed by birds. And what those birds do is they're fed by the waste of those animals, and they get into that animal feces and they like dig it apart and scratch it apart, and they're throwing that organic material all over the soil, leading to the further development and health of that soil, as well as taking out the bacteria that might cause issues with like giardia in water, or different bacteria that can be very harmful to the health of animals that are drinking out of that water. That makes sense. So when we look at how we farm today, what we've done is we've removed all of those, that kind of like multifunctional element of the farm that kept us sustained for so long. The farm that had some plants, some animals, all fertilizing together. So let's go back to that farm that you had a plot of land over here that was growing like tomatoes and avocados or whatever. And then you had this part that was being grazed by cows or goats. And then you had chickens who were taking the goat waste and like spreading it out and taking any harmful bacteria. Okay, so then we switch. So then you have a year over here of the goats or the cows or whatever grazing off of this part of the farm. And you have a year of these plants growing out of this part of the farm, and then you switch them. And now the cows or the goats are grazing over here. They're refertilizing this soil, and the plants are growing out of this heavily fertilized soil. So we don't do that nearly as much today. Today, what we do is we create farms that are entirely based on a monoculture. Monoculture is one, right? Mono means one. So when we have a monoculture, we have like 1,000 acres of corn. That one corn plant is going to do the same thing over and over and over to the soil. It's going to suck the same nutrients out, and it's going to leach the soil in its particular way. And so the way that we make up for the multiplicity of an ecosystem, of a regular ecosystem, of all that biomass and all those chemicals basically transporting proteins and transporting different minerals in between each other, if that makes sense. Transporting protein, if you think about that, or transporting chemicals by animals living, dying, those chemicals decomposing into the soil, enriching plants, feeding more animals. See the way that that's a transfer of chemicals. So what we've done to replace all of the diversity of that ecosystem is we've just replaced our modern farms diversity with a monoculture, one, and that monoculture being fed by all these artificial fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. So whereas we used to have plants and animals that kind of work together to keep the soil healthy, to keep pests, you have different types of plants that are pesticides for other plants. You have different types of plants that are herbicides for other plants. Now what we do is we take all of these manufactured synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, and what was the other one? Pesticides. And we are replacing the diversity of that farm and that ecosystem with all these synthetics. And so what happens is all of that replaces this, what happens with transformation, with translocation. What happens is we then like have this accumulation of, instead of decomposed materials, decomposed organic material, decomposed mineral material, now we have just this accumulation of synthetic herbicides, fertilizers. They make their way through the soil into our aquifers, into our drainage basins, out into the Gulf of Mexico. And we watched that movie on what happens with all of the material that moves its way down into through the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's interesting, once again, that we're trying to improve on nature when nature is already this incredible, perfect system that doesn't waste anything. So our transformation of decomposed materials that takes materials, and like I said, is the movement of those materials from like animal form into chemical form that adds to the soil. Translocation, that is how those materials, that transformed, decomposed material, now makes its way up and down through the soil horizons. So eluviation, with an E, eluviation, that's the downward transport of dissolved materials. So basically you have materials that decompose up here on the very surface of the soil, and then gravity is going to pull those materials down. So when gravity pulls those materials down, we call that eluviation. And then eluviation, with an I, that's the accumulation in lower soil horizons of materials from upper horizons. So that I'm going to go into in just a minute. So eluviation, that's the transport down. Remember, evapotranspiration is the transport up, right? Evapotranspiration is what allows different parts of the soil to move up through the horizons. Eluviation is what pulls it down as a result of gravity. So evapotranspiration is being powered by the sun. Eluviation is being powered by gravity. And then eluviation, with an I, is what happens when that material accumulates at the bottom of the soil horizon. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Translocation, vertical movement of material through soil layers, what we were just talking about. So translocation over here, that's the vertical movement of material through soil layers. Now, if we're in a different type of climate, and we're going to get into climate next week, but climate has there's 5 major different effects on climate. So there's 5 major different things that create a different climate. And we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about climate. But the biggest effect on climate, the number one thing that affects climate most, is latitude. How close you are to the equator, how close you are to the poles. So if we have these climate controls, and the biggest one is latitude, it makes sense that our soil, which is going to be which is going to affect climate, but also react to climate, depending on how far away you are from the equator or how close you are to the equator, you're going to have a type of soil that is going to be strongly affected by that uh, by that climate region that you're in, and that is going to create different elements of the soil that plants and animals will then adapt to. So in a cold climate, you get what's called a pan. So a pan is literally kind of like what it sounds like. We're just, I don't know if you've ever like gotten into dirt and like dug down into the dirt, and maybe you hit like a part of the soil that almost feels like a rock, like you hit like, so you're going through soft soil, and then you get to a part that's kind of like clink, 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 and then you can like get through it. And now you've broken apart this sort of, maybe you've seen it in sand as well. Sometimes when walking on the sand, you might notice that there'll be like this hard layer of sand. And when you walk through it, it like breaks apart into into, little hard kind of pieces. Um, so that pan is an accumulation of oxides, iron, aluminum, and it blocks drainage. So if it blocks drainage, so just imagine you have soil and you're in a cold climate and you have like nice like loose soil up here, and then you have this hard pan, this like layer of soil that it's permeable, like you could break through it. But when water is making its way down through the horizon layers, it's going to stop. It's going to have there's going to be an accumulation of water. And so this pan leads to the adaptation of different plants. Strawberries, for example. I think I said this in the very beginning of the semester, but strawberries, they love California, but but strawberries are a very shallow plant. And if you think about most of the plants that we eat, are annual plants. So you have two types of plants, right? You have an annual plant and you have a perennial plant. So an annual plant and a perennial plant. Well, our annual plant, that's one who has a life cycle of a year, whereas a perennial plant lives for much longer than a year. Now think about the difference in roots of an annual plant versus a perennial plant. An annual plant, because it has a relatively short life cycle, is going to have really short roots. So you're going to have, with an annual plant, you're just going to have roots that are short right in here. As opposed to a perennial plant, the roots are going to go really, really deep into the soil. Now, most of the food that we eat, most of our domesticated plants that we eat around the world are annual plants, meaning that they have really shallow roots. That's why topsoil is so important, because if we grow all of these plants that depend on the very, very top of the soil because their roots don't go that deep, then the top of the soil is going to allow us to harvest food for 9 billion people. And if we don't have healthy topsoil, if we allow our topsoil 1.7 billion tons of crop soil last year to be picked up and moved into the Mississippi, then what are we doing to ourselves? What we're doing to ourselves is we're destroying our capability and our ability to keep ourselves fed. So a lot of different plants have, like strawberries, for example, have very, very shallow roots. A strawberry grows in just like the very top part of soil. And strawberries like constant water. They don't want to be soaked, right? They don't want to like live in water, but they need the soil to be pretty wet, pretty damp. And they also like sun, which is one of the reasons that it can be kind of hard to grow strawberries in different climates. But here in California, we have a pan, and that pan is created down here from our dry climate. So the calcification of, and I've talked about calcification in our soil here in Santa Barbara, but calcification also creates a hard pan. So in a cold climate, you have the accumulation of iron that creates a hard pan. In our dry climate here in California, we have the accumulation of calcium carbonate that creates this hard pan as well. And different plants like strawberries, well, they just love that because it allows for them to sit in this shallow part of the soil, and it allows for them, this hard pan allows for like this shallow part of the soil to keep a good amount of moisture in it. If you didn't have that hard pan, that water would make its way down deeper, and it would be good for plants with deeper roots. But because we have plants like strawberries that have really, really shallow roots, and they just like this top like couple of inches of soil, that hard pan is what allows them to remain hydrated. And it's why California grows 90% of the country's strawberries. So different types of climates are going to have different effects on the mineral content of your soil. If you have a cold climate, you have the accumulation of iron, that leads to a hard pan. If you have a dry climate, you have the accumulation of calcium carbonate, that leads to a hard pan. And plants have adapted to those different hard pans, or to like the different types of soil. In a cold climate, you might think like, oh, well, plants need heat. Well, yeah, plants need heat, but some plants have adapted to a cold climate where they only germinate if temperatures get below freezing in the soil. So plants like blueberries, for example. Blueberries you can only grow in a cold climate because the soil has to get, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a cold climate year round, but there has to be a period of the year where the temperature gets very, very, like where the soil freezes. And that's what actually allows for those blueberries to germinate. So my point in saying all this is not so that you necessarily remember where strawberries grow or where blueberries grow, but so that you know different climates have different reaction or create different reactions in soil, depending on what the mineral content of that soil is. And plants have adapted to the climate and to the reaction of those chemicals in that soil. Okay. Factors in soil formation. We've got our arable soils. Arable soils are the soils that you can grow stuff on. So that's like if we're talking about population, a lot of people will talk about population by people per square mile. Well, it doesn't really matter how many people are per square mile if the soil is not arable. So if we were to talk about like just population distribution, and we looked at Arizona, for example, well, Arizona does not have the same carrying capacity, the same ability to carry as much of a population because their soil, because they're in a desert. So they don't have the same amount of arable soil as you would have in a place like Kansas. So when we talk about arable soil, we're talking about land that is suitable to grow vegetation. And so arable soil or arable climates, those are the places that we're concerned about when we're talking about the survival of our population. So our arable soils, those are ones that are going to have like good humus, good mineral content, the healthy soil that's going to have that like nice sponge-like quality that's going to allow for water to be absorbed into it and like kind of stick there. And then biological organisms, they affect soil as well. We talked about the worms. Look at this worm is going through, it's eating material, it's processing it through its body, leaving really, really rich worm castings behind. It's also creating nice little tubes that allow for that 50% of soil that is open space. And then we have these guys down here. What is that? That's a, not a beaver. That's a, it's not a gopher either. It's those guys that are blind. You know, they stole Thumbelina and Thumbelina. What is that animal? I completely forgot what that animal is. I'm sorry. Will somebody please tell me what that animal is? It is a badger. Nope, it's not a badger. It's not a beaver. It's not a freaking gopher. What is it? All right, somebody please tell me what that is. They are going to create even bigger holes, is the point. And those bigger holes can allow for more oxygen, more water to come in and be stored. It can also allow for kind of like more decomposition of material deeper in the soil. Let's see, we also have microorganisms, and please watch those 2 TED Talks that I put up, especially the one with Joel Salatin. He talks about microorganisms and basically the orgy that's happening in soil constantly that's keeping our soil nice and rich. And then the decomposition of plants. Those biological organisms are, like we said, affecting the health of that soil. Yeah. So our biological organisms are doing a whole lot with soil. They're also, and biological organisms also engineer entire ecosystems. Like, for example, a beaver, which I know this guy is not a beaver, but beavers are ecological engineers. You know, they build their little dams, and that creates all kinds of these little micro ecosystems. So our biological organisms are both breaking down and decomposing into the soil, but they're also affecting the structure of the soil by the way that they live in that soil. Okay. Oh, look, there's a beaver. So, like I said, we have our soil engineers, our beavers. They manipulate the landscape. They create small ponds, small lakes that can lead to an accumulation of biomass, an accumulation of sediment that then enriches the riparian community around that little pond or little lake that's created by the beaver. And you might think, what about dams that are created by humans? And haven't I kind of put down dams as being like artery blockers when it comes to a channel? So you have like a channel of water and we build a dam, and now suddenly we've stopped the transport of sediments and biomass all along that river channel. The difference is that a beaver is not going to build the Hoover Dam. They're not going to stop the Colorado River, for one, and two, the material that they use all allows for the filtering of water as well. So while they're creating a nice little pond or a little lake with their dam, this material is also going to allow for sediment and biomass and water to filter through, so you're not completely just stopping the movement of that channel. They keep soil waterlogged. Oh, that's one of the things that they can do, and how different organisms are affecting our soil, and they can retain waterborne sediments. Why did I spell born like that? Okay. So translocation, which I mentioned before, in desert climates can create salinization. What is salinization? What does it sound like? So salinization, what it sounds like is, okay, so so we had this happen here in California as well. Look at where am I pointing right now? So we had this happen on the eastern side of the Sierra, where we used to have the Owens River Valley. In the Owens River Valley, so the eastern side of the Sierra is an orographic desert. Remember, air hits a mountain, goes up over that mountain, precipitates. You're going to have the windward side of a mountain that's going to be pretty wet and lush, and the leeward side of a mountain that's going to be pretty dry. And so the leeward side of the Sierra Nevada, that's an orographic desert. But we had the Owens River Valley, we had like a good water supply. And then in the 1920s, LA was like, we would like that water, please. And so they built this aqueduct that transported water from the Owens River Valley down into Los Angeles. When they removed that water from a very dry area, what's left is an accumulation of minerals and stuff like that. And so when you have an overaccumulation of minerals, things that can dry things out like salt, minerals that can dry out soil like salt, for example, we have what's called salinization. So in desert climates, the translocation, right, the movement of material through different layers of soil can lead to an accumulation of salt or some sort of mineral like that kind of sitting at the top of soil. Then the ancient Sumerian civilization, they engineered irrigation. So they lived in a if you ever take human geography from me or world regional geography from me, I talk about the first civilization and the growth of agriculture, and how the first civilization in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, benefited from the mini ice age that led to this ice sheet. Remember, we learned about ice sheets last week, that came down through most of Europe today. And that water, and I talked about this in our lecture last week, that water ran off and created this fluvial geography in North Africa and Southwest Asia, and it was a very different climate at that time. And that's when civilization started. It started in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, when we had a different climate. Well, so what happens is at the end of the Pleistocene, you have these ice sheets retreat up into the Scandinavian peninsula. So now you have this entire civilization that's dependent on the physical geography, and the climate changes. So what happens is you have people who have to engineer irrigation. And where the original economy of Mesopotamia had been based on land ownership, it transfers to water control. And what it becomes what's called a hydraulic civilization, one that is one where you're wealthy and you're powerful if you control water. So our ancient Sumerian civilization engineered irrigation. It led to basically allowing the desert to bloom, the desert of Southwest Asia to bloom. Okay. So a moist climate can lead to a surplus of water, and that can leach calcium. Calcium is going to be an important mineral in the health of soil. That creates what's called decalcification. In a cold, wet climate, like in Canada, for example, you would have a conifer forest. Imagine like what a Christmas tree looks like, and a Christmas tree like covering like a forest of Christmas trees. That's what a conifer forest would look like. You have organic material that accumulates and releases acids that translocate from the E horizon. Remember, orangutans always eat, so that's going to be our third horizon, which leads to something called podzolization. So podzolization is when you have the translocation of organic material accumulating in that third layer of the horizon. It releases acids from biomass, has a lot of, like when biomass breaks down, it can be very acidic. And so you have what we call podzolization, which is the accumulation of acids in that third layer of the horizon. In a warm, hot, rainy climate, that would be somewhere like anywhere in the tropics, the Congo, Brazil, Indonesia, you have heavy aluminum and iron form clay, and then we have laterization. So laterization, you can have this heavy accumulation of iron and clay. You're also going to have very acidic soils in a warm, hot, rainy climate. Basically, you're going to have more biomass breaking down than eroded rock, and that's going to lead to acidic soil. Now, our different soil color can tell you a lot about the decomposition of minerals in soil. Black soil is the soil that's going to be really rich in humus. That's going to be the soil that has like a nice spongy composition to it. That's what we want for agriculture. What we want for agriculture is that rich black soil. Red soil is going to be richer in iron. Now, there's plenty of plants that love iron. Grapes love iron. So if we were to go to California, grows a lot of wine. I know about wine because I am a mom. So California grows a lot of wine. It has a lot of different soils. It has a lot of different climates. We have so many different microclimates here. If you are interested in California, take California geography in fall. So if we go up towards Paso Robles, Paso Robles is known for its Cabernets. Cabernet is a type of grape that leads to like a really rich red wine. Well, the reason that Cabernets love Paso Robles is because Paso Robles has these very iron-rich soils. Iron-rich soils because you have volcanic soils in Paso Robles, and Paso Robles is full of iron because of its volcanic soil. That leads to this red hue in the soil, and Cabernet grapes freaking love it. It's not just Cabernet grapes, but that's just an example. That's the thing that came to my head. And then white soil, that would be your soil that has not a whole lot of humus, not a whole lot of iron. It would be, it could be an accumulation of calcium or salt, but white soil is going to be dry soil. White soil is going to be, there's another train. Did I record this like when it was a passenger train, so it was short, like during the train's busy time? Okay, so looking around the world, we have different soil regions. Now, don't worry, you're not going to have to remember all of these. These are just different types of soils. If you were to take a seminar on soil, well, then yeah, you would want to learn all about these. If you were to take a whole class on soil, yes, you would want to learn about these. But for right now, in physical geography, we just want to notice first of all, the variety of soils. And remember, I said it takes at least 500 years to develop these soil types, and it's more like 1,000 or more years. And notice how the colors very much correlate with the latitude. So up here in our blue gelisols, that's going to be dry tundra, basically. It's not going to support a lot of life. And then we get down into the orange inceptisols. And then look at that nice green. It's going to be all through our prairie land, through our grasslands. Basically, when we go over climate, we're going to talk about how there are distinct climate regions with each kind of latitudinal process. So around here, come on, arrow, where are you, arrow? Around here, we have tropical soils. You have a lot of biomass. You have a lot of water. The soil tends to be pretty acidic, really, really rich in organic material. And then through here, these are true deserts, 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator, where you're going to have a lot of dry air, high pressure coming down from the atmosphere, not allowing for water vapor to rise and precipitate or condense and precipitate. But notice that while I said the true desert region is 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator, not all the soil types are the same. You know, if the only factor in climate was latitude, then all the soils would be the same through this region. But the difference is that you have microclimates. So we have, and we'll get into what microclimates are when we get into climate, but basically you have maybe mountain ranges, you have all kinds of different things that are going to affect these soil types. So there we go. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of factors that affect soil formation. Climate is one of the central factors that affect soil formation, and our different plants have adapted to what that climate is. So like I said earlier, there's certain plants that only germinate when soil temperatures get below freezing, but that's also true for some plants only germinate. Germinate means that like the seed is ready to grow. Some plants only germinate when the temperature gets like above a certain level as well. Like for example, pine cones, that's a seed, and that only germinates in, like, it has to get extremely hot. Here in California, we have a fire ecology. I know that fires are natural disasters for us, but they're actually a part of our ecology here in California. And different plants and animals have adapted to it. And so, for example, some of our plants that are native to Southern California only germinate when they're in a temperature like that you could only reach if you were in the middle of a fire. So our parent material is, like I've said earlier, that has to do with the broken down eroded rock. And then how is our human activity affecting soil? Now, I've given you a lot of examples of how human activity affects soil. And I would love it if you gave me some examples you have thought of how human activity can affect soil. Please watch those 2 TED Talks that I posted. They have to do with this lecture, and they get more into the health of soil and how it supports agriculture. And that's it. So I hope that you found soil somewhat interesting, and I hope you are all well. Please send me a message. Let me know how you're doing with this transition, isolated movement into where we are right now. And yeah, all right. Now I have to figure out how to turn this off. I don't think that I just Sure save. Just close down, please.